Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I would like to welcome you to the Campfire Chat organized by the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative on the topic of large-scale carbon dioxide removal and the Sustainable Development Goals. We have with us today three expert guest speakers to share their experience and, more importantly, their different perspectives on these issues. I will ask them in a moment to introduce themselves one by one. But just to briefly explain here, so the idea of this session is to have a discussion around the virtual campfire. We have not planned long speeches or series of slides. The idea is to have each speaker say a few words about their perspectives, and then we will have a discussion and then a question and answer session with all the participants. So let's start with the introduction. Maybe I'll start myself. My name is Janos Pasztor. I'm the Executive Director of the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative, C2G. I've been doing this since the beginning of the initiative in 2016. Before that, I worked in the United Nations for many years. My last position was Assistant Secretary General for Climate Change, working, amongst other things, for the success of the Paris Agreement, which we're just about celebrating the 5th anniversary of that landmark event. But I have worked in a number of other United Nations organizations, but also civil society organizations, including UNEP, UNFCCC, WWF, Stockholm Environment Institute, and so on. So basically, I've been working on climate change for the last 4 decades, and obviously not extremely successfully. There's still a few things left, and I hope that with the work that I'm currently doing and with these campfire chats as well, we can make a contribution. So thank you very much, and maybe I'd like to ask Jennifer to say a few words about herself. Jennifer Wilcox.
Sure, thank you. I'm very excited to be here and be part of the chat this morning my time. So I'm currently a senior fellow at the World Resources Institute, where I help to lead the carbon removal program there, but I'm also an academic. So I'm a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, and I'm joint in chemical engineering and energy policy. And my work is really focused on carbon capture from a technical perspective, being a chemical engineer by training, looking at a lot of the different approaches to separating carbon, whether it's through deep decarbonization, but also carbon removal directly from the atmosphere. And my work specifically spans the areas of using chemicals, but also using minerals. And mostly we look at balancing resources that are limited today. So looking at things like biomass waste, looking at land, energy, water, and how these should be prioritized for the different strategies, not just carbon removal from the atmosphere, but also deep decarbonization.
Thank you, Jennifer. Youba, may I ask you to introduce yourself, please?
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, because we are in Geneva in the afternoon. I'm Youba Sokona. I have different hats, but I'm a vice chair of IPC, but I am here under my personal capacity, not representing any organization. And then all my work, all my life has been focused on development in Africa, and then look at development different angles, and then through the lens of energy, and then through the lens of different environmental issues such as desertification and climate change issues. And I work at universities, non-governmental organization, intergovernmental organization, United Nations, and I set up the African Climate Policy Center, and then that to help the African country, and then to elaborate different policies and on climate issues. I'm happy to be part of this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Youba. And may I ask you, Martin, to introduce yourself? Martin.
Thank you very much, Janos. Martin Frick. I'm currently serving as deputy to the special envoy of the Secretary General for the Food System Summit, which will be next September. I can speak more about that later. I have a background in diplomacy, and as a human rights expert, I came across climate change first in Geneva in 2007 with the Human Rights Council, where the Maldives run the first resolution on climate change and human rights. And ever since, I've been on a steep learning curve that had brought me to the human face of climate change, the questions of climate justice, and the solutions to it. And I'm quite fascinated by the potential of actually addressing climate change and achieving the SDGs in tandem, and believe that land and particularly food systems are central to that. Thank you, and back to you, Janos.
Thank you, Martin, and thank you to all three of you for participating in this event. And I think we can look forward to a very interesting discussion in a moment with your different backgrounds and different perspectives. So just a few words about the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative, C2G. We are a relatively small foundation-funded initiative. We've got 16 people working virtually, and we did that even before COVID, working on 4 continents. And our mission is very simple, is to catalyze the creation of effective governance frameworks for approaches that can alter the climate, such as in particular large-scale carbon dioxide removal and solar radiation modification. It's very important to say that our approach is impartial about the use or not of these techniques, and that's been so important for us to engage with different stakeholders and to provide also impartial information about these techniques. One important part of our strategy is to encourage learning through conversations like the one we're about to have around this virtual campfire chat. Now, the purpose of this series of events, these campfire chats that we've had, and this particular event today as well, is to show that there is a diversity of views, and we do that by having different views expressed by different invited guests. Now, obviously, on some of these issues, there are many different views, and it's impossible to have so many people in any particular campfire chat, but we try to do our best for each session to aim for a maximum of geographical, gender, socio-political context type of diversity, but we obviously can't reach that for every webinar and every campfire chat. But overall, I think we're doing okay. We've had over 50 experts involved in this series from very different parts of the world. So I think we on the whole, we have managed to present the diversity that is out there. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, the objective of this session is not to come to any particular conclusion, not to convince the others. It's rather to understand that there may in fact be different views, different perspectives on these issues. So we very much hope that Youba, Jennifer, Martin, you will address those different sets of issues during the discussion. Of course, recognizing that those are your views and they are not necessarily the views of C2G. A few words about the context in which we're having this discussion, and I won't be very long because I think we all know these issues very well, but I think it's good to remind ourselves that the climate crisis continues. We're just barely over 1 degree centigrade global heating, and the impacts are everywhere, whether it's heat waves in the Arctic or forest fires or extreme heat in different parts of the world. The impacts are clearly there and visible. The special report on 1.5 degree of the IPCC made it very clear that countries must go into absolute turbo mode to reduce their emissions. And even if they do that, even if the emissions are reduced in a massive way, the world will still need carbon dioxide removal, perhaps even quite substantial amounts of carbon removal, depending on how fast we have reduced our emissions. First to offset the difficult emissions, and later to also remove carbon in an absolute sense to move toward the net negative, which we will need to do. But unfortunately, the reality is that the world is not yet in this super emission reducing mode, even though there are some nice commitments that are being made, but the short to medium term plans don't reflect that. And some scientists are also saying that in addition to carbon emission reductions and carbon removal, we may also need solar radiation modification, which is the other part of our work. We will not address that issue here in this campfire chat. Now, the net zero targets, the net zero commitments that many countries and non-state actors have been putting in place are also putting a particular impetus on this discussion, because most of those activities will require some level of carbon dioxide removal, again, to reduce, to offset current difficult emissions, to reduce, and eventually to remove carbon in a net negative way. And because we also cannot forget that there is life after 2050, and some of the decisions we have to take today will become reality at that time. So which techniques need to be used and when? Is it nature-based? Is it technology-based? Is it some kind of hybrid? What kind of societal discussions does one need in order to reach some kind of social license and ability to operate? These are the kind of questions that need to be addressed. And then we have the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. And all of the techniques we're talking about will have an impact on most of the Sustainable Development Goals. Sometimes positive, sometimes negative, but they will have impacts. And they will have an impact on the SDGs, which of course finish in 2030, and whatever similar or somewhat different system governments come up with to the period beyond 2030. In fact, we have a recent paper which we commissioned recently with some authors, Mr. Honegger and Mikhailova and Roy, which have actually looked at this in greater detail, and that has just been published commercially. So this is all very important issues. And all of these bring up some of the key governance challenges. What are the governance gaps at the national level, at the international level? What are non-state actors doing? How intergovernmental frameworks are addressing these issues, and especially how these issues are connected between different governance frameworks, whether it's the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Food Systems Summit, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. So obviously our Campfire Chat will not address all these issues, but we do hope that it will make a good contribution to these. So with that, I will stop talking about the issues myself, and I'd like to turn now to the rest of the Campfire Chat. So as mentioned at the beginning, I will ask each of our guest speakers to one sort of start-off question and ask them to respond in about 2-3 minutes of their time. And then I hope that we'll have a little bit of a discussion within the group of the speakers and around this virtual campfire. In the meantime, for the participants, I would appreciate if you could start preparing any questions that you may have. There is the Q&A button on the Zoom application, and you can put your questions there. Don't forget there is a possibility to like questions. So if you see a question somebody else has asked, then you can like that, and then that will give a higher priority to that question. This is especially useful if there are many questions being posed. There's also a chat function if you like to chat, but we will be not monitoring the chat function in terms of the Q&A. We'll start the Q&A toward the last half an hour, 40 minutes of the session, depending on how many questions are already there. So that's basically where we are. And with that, I would now like to start asking our guest speakers some questions. So maybe I'll start with Jennifer, if I may. And if you could give us a quick overview of the different carbon dioxide removal approaches and the associated governance challenges that are out there. Thank you, Jennifer, please.
Sure, happy to do that. So really, and as you had mentioned, Janos, in the introduction, these are often split into nature-based versus technical or technology-based. So with the nature-based approaches, there are approaches such as afforestation, and which essentially means planting trees on land that didn't previously have them. And then there's also reforestation. There's also advanced agricultural practices that will increase the uptake of carbon in soil. And then improved management of forests is another approach that's nature-based. In terms of technology-based solutions, that's really in my wheelhouse. So one approach is called direct air capture, which is using chemicals to react with CO2 in the atmosphere. But The issue with direct air capture too is that it's not carbon capture and storage in a single step, like a lot of the biological based processes are. So it needs to be coupled to permanent storage in order for it to be a carbon removal. So it's more of a systems-based approach. And so then there's another set of approaches that I think are in between nature-based and in between the more technology-based, and that's bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. So in that case, typically you can think of it as a biomass waste, but the biomass waste could be used for energy generation. It could be electricity, but it could also be biomass gasification to hydrogen production. And when you do that and you capture and store the CO2 in that process, you can actually produce negative hydrogen, which could be a feedstock for whether it's energy or fuels. So that's pretty interesting. And absolutely not just a nature-based approach, but also a technology-based approach. And then finally, there's mineralization. And so mineralization is looking at the Earth's crust and the fact that there's naturally available minerals like calcium and magnesium that are rich in the Earth's crust, and looking at accelerated ways in which we can react those minerals with CO2. And a lot of the work that we're doing in my group isn't just understanding the natural processes and enhancing them in place, but maybe even looking at events that take place today, like mining, abandoned mines, like asbestos even. And there are opportunities where we can look at mine tailings and react them with CO2 in the atmosphere, but they may need a little engineering in order to push them along, to make them happen on a time scale that actually impacts climate. And so those are really, there's still a lot of nuances and details associated with the various approaches. There's also ocean approaches where we impact the ocean alkalinity as a means to enhance CO2 storage there. But that's really a broad overview of the different approaches. In terms of the challenges, one issue is that we need to think about doing this on the gigaton scale. And so how do we support the deployment of each of these approaches? The other issue is that carbon dioxide removal, just as you mentioned, Janos, is really first and foremost to deal with and offset the difficult, the hard to avoid emissions. It's still unclear what that wedge is and the size of that wedge. And I think it's really important that we responsibly think about CDR and not use it as a means to keep emitting carbon at the rates that we're doing today. I think that we need to keep in mind that deep decarbonization needs to happen as fast as possible. And we need to recognize that some of the resources that are required for deep decarbonization on the gigaton scale are the same resources that are going to be required to do CDR on the gigaton scale. And so being able to understand what are the land requirements, what are the low carbon energy requirements, what are the water requirements, and what are the biomass wastes that are available, and where are the best where's the best geology in order to sequester the CO2 away, which we need for carbon capture and storage at point sources, but we also need that for carbon removal like BECCS and DACs. And so I think it's really important that we understand all of these limited resources that exist and how they're going to be prioritized across the different strategies. And that's really it. It's about strategy, I think, and thinking ahead. They don't have to be competitive. I hope that we can think ahead about some of these approaches so that we don't get into that situation. And so, yeah, so that's kind of an overview and some of the scale challenges, and hopefully we'll get to talk some of the details out in this chat today.
Thank you, Jennifer. And just if I may, a quick follow-up question. If you could just say a few words about the fact that these different nature-based, technology-based approaches, they might end up with carbon stored in very different ways and probably for very different time horizons. And what are the governance challenges in relation to that?
Yeah, so the durability of the storage is an issue, right? And so, and one of the things I didn't talk about is also the costs and the variety of costs that you see against the nature-based versus the more technology-based approaches. Today, it appears that the technology-based approaches like direct air capture are expensive, but we also know when coupled to geologic storage, that's a permanent removal of the carbon. It's durable storage. And so imagine a forest. It's unclear how long the carbon is going to be stored, especially with what we're seeing in California recently with the wildfires and also in Australia. And so understanding what is the cost maybe of maintaining forests such that they're not so prone and susceptible to this kind of reversibility. I don't think that that's inexpensive. I think that that also could create jobs. And so to me, it's not so clear today what the true cost is of some of the nature-based solutions if they're actually deployed in a way that could help to ensure the durability and the storage. But you're right, the durability of storage is really diverse across each of these approaches, and the costs are diverse across each of these approaches. And I think, you know, I'm not convinced that the nature-based solutions could be considered the inexpensive ones today if we're really to put in that other dimension of durability of the storage and the permanence of removal.
Thank you. And we may come back to some of these issues, but I think I'd like to go to Youba now. And Youba, you mentioned about your extensive involvement on development issues. And I must recall, I first met you in the late 80s working on energy and development. So that's been great. A lot of things have happened since then. But maybe in that context, how do you think carbon dioxide removal approaches could impact the pursuit of sustainable development, and how sustainable development can impact the pursuit of carbon dioxide removal options in different parts of the world? Any thoughts that you could share with us? Your mic, please.
Oh, I don't know why, because I turned it on. But this seem a very simple question, but very complex and complicated. And as the issues we are dealing with, because we have the tendency of simplifying the problem that is more complex and complicated. And the fact that we cannot isolate the climate issues and development issue, because if we are facing problem, it's related to the development path that has been taken by industrialized countries and some of the emerging economies, and that lead to the problem we are facing. And we are at a juncture where we need to find a way how to deal with it. At the same time, we cannot look at it in isolation because everything is related to everything. Taking in isolation, we will not get there. Jennifer indicated some of the various approaches being based on nature or based on technology. And it has to happen somewhere, some places, because everything cannot be in the air. It has to be somewhere, some places. And then the location matters and where those actions will take place. And this is very important. And if it takes place in, an environment where development is a critical issue, poverty is a critical issue, fundamental issue, and then so it will be in competition with some of the pressing issues. I'm sure that will be addressed by Martin related to the food. And then the way you conceive your development is related to the climate issue. At the same time, the way also you deal with the climate issues will impact development, because if we look at the sustainable development is an aspiration, a global aspiration for the poor country as well as for the wealthier country. And then some can jumpstart, and then by avoiding the way that has been taken by industrialized country, and then some need to change completely, and then that is the whole discussion on the transition aspect. And saying that, I think it's very important to not looking at different responses to climate in isolation, because we cannot look at, carbon dioxide removal in isolation to deep mitigation. And then that has been also indicated by Jennifer, because we cannot, because we are in a situation where you need to have a basket of responses options. And then each of them has to play a certain role. We need to have a sense of each of us has to play a certain role. Each of us will also, each of them will have also an impact on sustainability, sustainable development. If you take the industrialized country context, for instance, if it will be at the sake of social issues that will have an impact on social component, social element of sustainability, sustainable development aspect. If it happened in poorer country, that have a huge implications. So you will solve, maybe you may solve one problem, but you end up to create a wider range of problems. And then that will be economic in nature, it will be social in nature, it will be environment in nature as well.
Thank you, Youba. And I think the way you describe the complex interrelated nature of these issues is really important. And we'll come back to this in a little while, because I think there are some important follow-up questions that we need to address. But before that, I'd like to come to Martin. And Martin, you mentioned your recent role at the UN Food Systems Summit. And it would be really interesting to hear from you that if we look at the SDG goal 2 on zero hunger and its linkages to other SDGs, maybe if you could help us to understand how to properly incentivize carbon dioxide removal in the food systems context, and how to ensure that stakeholders focused on carbon objectives address the broader objectives, such as those related to food systems. And I think that links also to what Youba was trying to say, is we can't just look at these things in isolation. Please share with us a few thoughts on how you see that.
Thanks very much, Janos. And indeed, this is a food system summit, and it's not a food summit, which is why it is in New York. This is why it's in the context of the SDG Decade for Action. Because I think food systems are a wonderful example that we are in a tight spot because we do not think in systems, but because we think in silos. Ministers of agriculture, ministers of environment have all too often been seen as advocating for two different agendas and thinking in trade-offs and zero-sum games, when these things actually need to come together. I've been for many years in the UNFCCC COP process, and it was quite interesting to see how basically it started off with meteorologists, experts on the world climate, and then there was the recognition that we need to fix our energy system. Then transport came along, and in a first wave with red, forestation came in. But we always sort of neglected the elephant in the room, which food systems really are, because FAO is estimating that agriculture produces roughly 21-22% of global emissions. But if you think of food as a system, including food waste, which is massive, cold chains, plastic wrapping, transport chains, and all of that, I would estimate that we are easily at 36-37% of global greenhouse gas emissions related to food systems. And at the same time, we have massive issues in our food systems. FAO has just come out with a study saying 3 billion people, that's almost half of the world's population, cannot afford healthy diets. So while for many years we've been looking at calories, we need to look at nutrition. We need to look at what quality of food people are getting. And in the current COVID crisis, we see that the interrelationship between malnutrition and vulnerability to, for example, a pandemic. So I guess my point is that we are challenged with the SDGs, and we are always saying these are 17 SDGs that are interrelated, really to look at the cross linkages. So cheap agricultural production is actually not cheap if you factor in the public health costs of it, if you factor in the inequality, and in particular, if you factor in the carbon footprint of it. A big amount of the carbon that went up in the atmosphere comes from land use change, comes from loss of arable land and from soils. But if you turn that around, there's quite an exciting opportunity to basically create jobs. And we have 1 billion people working directly in food production and 2 billion who are dependent somehow from working in food production systems. Now, if you think of a young continent like Africa, where we constantly need jobs for young people, I think there's an opportunity to link many different agenda items: development, jobs for young people, carbon sequestration, working on public health, and very importantly, restoring degraded land and bring it back, not only as a carbon sink, but as a carbon sink, of course, but also as a means to create peace and stability, because land degradation, if you think about Lake Chad, for example, and loss of arable lands is quite often also a driver for instability. So with this summit, we are trying to make the point of the centrality of food systems. And we are not only looking into the production side, we are looking strongly into the consumption side, into the possibility of nature positive production. And I think that is our way of framing what we are talking here about: large-scale carbon removal through agricultural change of production models. But we are also talking about resilience, which is happen to be built at the same time as you build a diverse agricultural system, and livelihoods, because so many people are depending from that. So my perspective here would be to really take a much broader look at the interrelatedness of the issues and embed this desire for large-scale carbon removal into a broader development agenda. And I think it's really surprising, if you look closely, how many synergies are there. And it seems to me that this thinking in trade-offs, should we rather do this or that, is a bit past. Like for many years, when in the UNFCCC process, we spoke about mitigation versus adaptation. And in the situation in which we are now, we need all of that. We need adaptation, we need resilience, we need mitigation, and we need large-scale carbon removal, because we are 12 here. And I think our food systems are an absolutely central part, and one that is relatively cheap. And Jennifer, I hear you. It's not for free, but it's relatively cheap, and it's something that can be turned around quite rapidly, I believe. Let me stop here, Janos, and back to you.
Thank you, Martin. And it's interesting, both you and Jennifer referred to cheapness of certain functions that may not be so cheap, but may be cheap. So depending on the sort of frame we put around these issues, right? So maybe we'll come back to these as the discussion goes. But what I wanted to ask all four of you is or three of you, sorry, how from your perspectives, how you see this? Because on the one hand, Youba made this very clear. You cannot look at these in isolation. Things are linked together. Martin, you yourself made this point that in a different way, that these are systemic issues, that there are linkages. You said, and I quote, I hope I quote you right, embed the carbon into the broader development agenda. But how do we do this? Do we start with carbon and then look at the development agenda? Do we look at the development agenda and see how carbon has an impact on that? There must be, we must have learned something over the last 20 years that would help us to see how we do this. So
I'm tempted to provoke a bit, Martin.
Good.
Because this is precisely the point. He rightly pointed out all the elements related to the food system, and then to the nutrition aspect and other. He has a convincing, story on those, and then he gets the point right. If you take health, you can have this similar discourse. If you take energy, on which I'm working, you can have the similar energy. Each of them are equally important. If you take any of the 17 goals, they are all important. The problem is, this is to just look at one lens and then not put in the context of development and then how you make your development more sustainable. And this is the problem. And then we look at the symptoms of the development, and then we are not looking at in a broader sense. And then so that things get disconnected. And he rightly pointed out that we are in a moment, because actually in the climate, early days of the climate, everything was related to mitigation, because at that time we should mitigate if we start mitigating. We did not. So adaptation emerged as a critical concern because we have not mitigated. And then we have to look at the both at the same time. The problem get complex, complicated, and then how you split limited financial resources between the two, and then how you bring the conflict interest between the two. And then we did not also adapt. And then at the same time, we need a more deeper mitigation. And then so that problem gets difficult, and then we have to look at different other aspects. This is how the carbon dioxide removal is part of the things we need to look at. But at the same time, we are not changing our way of dealing with those different issues. We still look at them in isolation. And then that's the problem. And then even the mechanism in which we are discussing, because one year we have one summit, another year we have another summit, another year we have another summit. It brings some focus on a number of issues, but we have to put that in a much more broader and global context. Sorry to be long. But
no, that's Jennifer, Martin, do you have any views yourself or reactions to what Youba said? We're still at this silo mentality, and that's even if we can put carbon removal into another silo, it's still a silo, right? So please.
I started off saying that it is a very hard thing, because people are comfortable in their silos, and having these discussions broader is not an easy one. And in recognizing that, with this summit, we are trying out something new, which is we are inviting all countries, that's 197 countries of the UN membership, to host food system summit dialogues in the countries, with a view of bringing all of society together to basically discuss these issues. And we hope that we can catalyze these conversations. And, you know, I mentioned the example of ministers of agriculture and environment. You would not believe in how many cases this would be the first time that they are actually together on one stage, discussing and bringing things together. I mean, look at an issue like stunted children in least developed countries. They are mostly stunted because they don't have access to enough animal protein in the first 1,000 days of their lives, right? Now we have a global debate in which we are speaking about meat consumption and cows and methane emissions, but that's a very northern debate, because there are places in sub-Saharan Africa where children desperately would need eggs, milk, and meat. But now you could see it as a trade-off and saying, well, we have to live with the methane emissions here in order to give these children a possibility to grow up and develop as fully as they deserve, right? But it is not a trade-off, because if you are introducing actually traditional grazing methods back on African grasslands, you can improve the soil organic carbon or content of the soils. And you will have actually a production model that is good for the climate, not bad. But this is not to be generalized, because the very same cow that would stand in a stable in an OECD country and being fed with soy from deforested areas is a completely different story. So it's complicated, and it's not a black and white story. It is really something that needs local consideration. And, you know, last week we had a brilliant discussion about, you know, a case study, tomato. If you are a Dutch citizen, and that Netherlands is a big producer of tomatoes, do you buy the local ones that are coming out of a greenhouse that is heated? Or do you buy the ones that are coming from Spain, which are, are exposed to ample sun and heat? And it's actually a question of what's more important for you. Is it water stress? Then you shouldn't buy those from Spain. Is it greenhouse gas emissions because of the heating? Then you shouldn't go for the Dutch ones. So that only as a flavor of the complexity of these issues. But I think triggering a debate about it, getting people to think about this as a system and not just a niche topic for the Minister of Agriculture would be really helpful to get these discussions and to get scientists to really look into the issues in each country and maybe region to region, because there's so many different food systems on this planet.
Thank you. I think, Jennifer, you also wanted to come in on this.
Oh, just a little bit. So I don't disagree. And I think it's just a complicated issue, but some of, one strategy, again, it goes back to what Martin said, which is just consideration of the local regions. What are the resources available? And that I think also an issue is that there's not a blanket solution. And so it needs to really be bottom up in terms of strategies, appreciating what the limitations of a given region are. But then in other regions, there could be a surplus of opportunities, and maybe that there could be some evening out of these things so that we can have more equity. I've always found it interesting, in the space of carbon removal is so much more diverse than deep decarbonization or avoiding emissions in the first place. And avoiding emissions, it tends to be that the countries that are the highest emitters have the greatest potential. And so now, though, with carbon removal, you have everything from land to geology to low carbon energy opportunities. There are regions where photovoltaics and wind make more sense than in certain parts of the world than other parts. And so with CDR, it's just very, very different, and it's very broad. And some of the resources that could be available in some regions and not in others, but there's always something. There's always something. And so I think it's really important to just appreciate, what those aspects are regionally. And that's why it's such a difficult, path, because it's not the same solution everywhere.
Thank you. And Youba, at the beginning, you mentioned, oh, you want to come in on that? Okay, go ahead.
Jennifer, no, I just want, because at the global level, things are very clear. There's no disagreement on things that need to be done at global level. Can we just zoom at the regional level? Is there any potential for CDR deployment in Africa that at the same time will support development aspiration of the continent? Or is it completely different from, Southeast Asia, for instance? Because if you cannot, because afforestation, reforestation, restoring land degradation, and then everything is perfect, it's good. But let us zoom in. Can we have some conversation zooming in at the regional level?
Yeah. I think Youba just made a perfect example. If you are planting 10 million trees in a piece in the developing countries, and the local population doesn't have a benefit of it, what do you think is going to happen with these trees within a very short period of time?
You'll be caught in lots of campfires will be burned from it.
Exactly. I think that is also what civil society often criticizes about nature-based solutions, with a lot of reason to it, saying that all of this can only work if it works for the local population. And we need to be a little bit smarter than just look at a tree as a piece of carbon. We need to understand how it adds to the income, how it builds resilience, who has actually the right to take the fruits of this tree. Can cutting down this tree ultimately even be a resilience coping strategy and provide income if everything else fails? And this broader discussion would actually help to get our global agenda, where we are looking at the planet and say, well, we need to get the carbon out of the atmosphere, down to a very local level, and talk to the people in a village and say, this is why it's good for you. This is why you should be helping us. This is why you should be protecting these young trees, because otherwise it just will not work. And I guess that's the main point. And Youba, I understand you also that this is something you're advocating for.
Yeah.
Okay, can I, first of all, I'd like to remind our participants to ask some questions. Some of them have already happened, so we'll come to those in a moment. But before going to the questions from the participants, I just want to dig a little bit deeper into this discussion, because I think this is really interesting. We heard about maybe there could be different places where there could be a surplus of conditions where CDR could take place. Youba was saying at the beginning, location matters, and then let's focus on something more specific. So I guess what I would like to ask each of you from your different perspectives, you know, Jennifer, if you were your WRI hat, not so much the academic hat, not that they are necessarily that different, but they are to some extent. Martin, you were organizing this summit, and Youba, you have different hats. So, but working, let's say, on development in Africa. How does one help? What are the 2 or 3 things that you could suggest that could actually help to move us out of the silo mentality, so that we end up actually looking at these things in totality? Because it's difficult, as we heard. So what are the 2 or 3 things from your perspectives that you could suggest that actually could help? Any of you would like to start?
Well, maybe.
Okay.
Because I have one eye also on the chat, and there's the question about biochar. And biochar is a wonderful example of a really simple, cheap, and accessible technology to improve soil organic carbon. It's simple things like biodigesters, where you can bring food waste and harvest losses and so on into an energetic use on the one side that can power a simple light or even a gas generator, and at the same time provides a cheap and safe organic fertilizer that is helping people on the land. There is possibilities in renewable energy that can really help local populations. Solar powered drip irrigation is not that expensive. And it's one of the big development success stories is that the need for renewable energy drove down the price for solar so drastically. And I think it has really done a lot of good in the development world. And so there are many, many proven techniques. And often, if I just may make this point, these are labor intensive techniques. If you have silvopastoral system, agroforestry system, it is not the classic development model of having a giant field and 12 automatic harvesters working it, but it is labor intensive. But our paradigm of being efficient agriculture is one that is highly mechanized, is maybe not the right paradigm for a country in which many, many people are looking for employment, are looking for livelihoods. And then there's the whole question about how do you make that attractive for young people? And we are working with a whole set of African youth groups that are doing fantastic things because they're doing land restoration on a very hands-on level. And at the same time, they're using renewable energy and satellite connections to digitally connect to the world. So people don't feel left behind. So it's this very low tech and very high tech at the same time that is providing really interesting solutions and can replace, for example, extension services that in many countries simply do not exist anymore or exist only for commercial interests to sell specific products to farmers, which they might be not always needing. So back to you.
If I may, I think that as Martin indicated, it will be important to contextualize the problem because decisions are every day made and implemented at national level, from local to national. Decisions are not made and then implemented at the global level. And then these conversations need to take place at the national level. And then it's there that you can contextualize And you know, the problem is that people will go to discuss about climate. In many countries, they go to discuss about climate. That the real issue is that to go to discuss about how you make your development compatible with climate imperatives. That is completely different other aspect, because we really have an old narrative for a new, much complexified problem. And then we want to discuss that at the global level. If we look at the national level, is there any opportunity? And then from the small scale, because there is different techniques, there is different approaches for nature-based solution. As we said it, shifting the agricultural system, the small scale farming system, where they increase their production by clearing more land. They are not increasing the productivity of the system, because there is a minimum energy input in agricultural sector. For instance, in Africa, 3% of agricultural area are irrigated. The use of fertilizer in African context is 7 kilos per hectare. I was giving a talk with a youth in Mali the other day. They said that they want to not at all use fertilizer. This is a completely wrong message. How you can do agriculture in a fragile ecosystem, you don't need fertilizer. You know, to bring those different elements, if you change the nature of agricultural system by increasing the productivity, and then you change completely the dynamic, and then you go to the direction of the CDR, because you will have a reduced land, and then you have much more wider land for carbon sequestration. At the same time, you solve the local problem. That needs to be contextualized at the national level.
Jennifer?
Sure, I have a couple of points to make, one tangentially related. So one thing I just want to point out is, you know, with direct air capture in particular, there are multiple technologies. And one of them, there's a company out of Switzerland called Climeworks. And it's a solid sorbent-based technology, not that different from the catalytic converter in your automobile. And there's misconception associated with direct air capture that it needs water in order to operate. And this is a misconception. So that approach in particular is a net producer of water. And so it captures CO2 from the atmosphere, but in doing that, it also pulls some of the water from the atmosphere. And so there is this co-benefit of deploying it in regions where water is scarce, because it's a net producer. The other piece of that technology that's important is that it actually can operate with pretty low energy requirements. And so if you have waste heat associated with, say, any kind of process, maybe it's combined heat and power using biomass waste or something like this, you could actually fuel this direct air capture technology. So I think, you know, there are other CDR approaches too, not just, you know, agricultural directly related or trees and that require large land area and arable land. Direct air capture does have a place. The other piece that I'll say, not related to food, but related to CDR, is mineralization. And so when we talk about renewables and we talk about the need for battery storage, and you have to think about what are the elements that are required for increasing the scale of batteries. Some of those materials are nickel, and they're also cobalt. And so looking at mining those materials and how that industry is going to move forward as we depend more and more on batteries for dealing with intermittent renewables is going to be very important. And looking at regions where those mining opportunities and activities are taking place, CO2 sequestration can be coupled to that. Whether the CO2 is avoided from a point source or the CO2 is from the atmosphere, CO2 reactivity with the tailings, we've already spent the energy mining and creating this waste. And now you can take care of two wastes. You can take care of the mining waste and you can take care of CO2 as a waste in the same process. And that also can lead to very, you know, that's also labor intensive and can lead to jobs. And so understanding the role of mineralization and the opportunity for CDR and sequestration, I think is something to consider.
That's really interesting, Jennifer. And in fact, it leads me to a question I wanted to ask. To what extent, if at all, can we say that nature-based solutions are better for development as opposed to, you know, technology-based ones? Can we even say that in general? And if, can we say it specifically on a project by project, location by location basis? How do we address that? Because there's a tendency by many to say that, well, nature-based solutions is the way to go for development. So any reactions to that from any of you?
Janos, if I may, I think it's again very context specific. And I think Jennifer spoke precisely about systems emissions, steel, cement, these things. And, you know, there might be the only way to address it by chemically sequestering the carbon that comes out, or even better, turning it into a raw material for production if you have very clean carbon. I'm not so much aware of the remineralization agenda, and I would be interested to learn more about that. But it is obviously a fact that in least developed countries, the agricultural systems are existing systems. People are working in agriculture, but quite often they are not having access to basic information, inputs, simple things like it's reliable weather forecast, for example. So I think the interesting part about nature-based solution or food system-based solution in these countries is that it's quite doable. It is not over the top expensive, and it can really change things as early as the next growing season. And that is pretty unrivaled from other technologies, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Any other reactions to that? If not, then I would like to suggest that we look at some of the questions coming in from the floor. We've already had one which we addressed, the one linked to Biochar, so thank you, Martin, for that. But there's an interesting question here from Michael's Fifth, and liked by somebody else as well. He says, I'd like to hear the guest talk about the use of direct air capture for CO2 enhanced oil recovery, and particularly about how CO2 enhanced oil recovery could triple or quadruple proven oil reserves. So maybe, Jennifer, if I can ask you first to even explain to us what is enhanced oil recovery.
I had a feeling that I was going to be the one to answer.
And then maybe the others have some thoughts as well, but go ahead, please.
Right. And so just briefly, when oil is recovered from the earth, there's a method called primary production, which just means we know that oil takes millions of years to form in the earth, and it's held under pressure. If it wasn't, it wouldn't have formed in the first place. And so when you drill a well for the production of oil, simply you're reducing the pressure, and so you can recover that oil easily. There's secondary methods like water flooding. So water is injected in order to increase that pressure back up to enhance oil recovery that way. CO2 in its supercritical form, so there's high temperature and pressures, can actually be a third method, a tertiary recovery of oil, when all those other methods have been exhausted and you've plateaued the production. And so what happens is at the supercritical conditions, the CO2 is miscible with the oil in the subsurface, and it changes all of the properties in terms of like viscosity and surface tension. So it just comes out easier when you use supercritical CO2. And so you have an injection well with CO2, and you have a production well. And when you produce the oil, the CO2 is dissolved. And so when you bring it up to the surface, just like opening a can of soda, you're releasing the CO2. When you get to the surface, the CO2 is separated out for the most part, and you've produced the oil. And what the oil operators do today is they inject that CO2 over and over and over again because it costs them money, the CO2. Right. And so the CO2 that's used for EOR enhancement is all left in the ground. It doesn't go back in the air. But the issue is that the oil that's produced is new carbon. And so the CO2 that we use for EOR today produces new carbon. And then that carbon, is in that oil, which of course you refine it, you transport it, all of that has emissions. Most of the carbon from oil is actually in the fuel itself. We burn it in an internal combustion engine and it ends up in the atmosphere. So now we have fresh carbon. So there's a couple of issues with CO2 for EOR, in my perspective. One is very mathematical, and that is in economical. So the price of oil is very volatile. And if you take even direct air capture, even avoided carbon, and you couple it to that industry. If you build a carbon capture plant, whether it's, you know, on a natural gas-fired power plant or it's direct air capture, that CO2 in producing the CO2 from the point source or from the atmosphere takes money. It's not cheap. If it's a point source, maybe it's as low as $50 a ton. If it's the atmosphere, maybe it's as high as today, $600 a ton, although likely it can be coming down if we increase deployment. Point is it's expensive, and it's much more expensive using that anthropogenic CO2 than what the operators mainly do today. So where CO2 is sourced today from for enhanced oil recovery, 85% is actually mined naturally from the earth. So just like oil and gas is stored in the earth, CO2 is also in the earth. And so they mine CO2 naturally, and 85% of it is mined. And that's why we have an existing infrastructure of pipelines in the US, is because we're actually, you know, connecting the mined CO2 to the oil opportunities, the EOR sites. And so today it's pretty cheap, relatively speaking, to just use the mined CO2 versus anthropogenic CO2. And so with the price of oil, when oil drops in price, now all of a sudden that anthropogenic CO2 becomes too costly. So what that means is it leaves the carbon capture project behind. And now to me, it's a risk to couple EOR with CO2 if you want to deploy carbon capture, because it's as soon as the price of oil drops to a certain value, you no longer get that project. And this happened in the United States with a project called Petronova. It's not that the carbon capture didn't work, it's because the price of oil went too low and we had to shut down the operation. And so I think that's just an accounting issue, but then of course there's a moral issue. And that's, you know, here we are trying to move towards a sustainable future. We know that there's a lot of opportunities in terms of low carbon energy. And so to enhance routes that couple something that we're trying to deal with our carbon emissions, certainly from direct air capture, to spend all of that energy and cost only to enable more production of carbon, to me seems counterintuitive. And it's very tricky. Even as a chemical engineer, like I understand, you know, that we need to move through intermediate solutions. And today, unfortunately, there's not a lot of utilization opportunities for CO2. We take CO2 out of the air, we avoid it from a point source. What do we do with it? If it's on the gigaton scale, what scales to gigatons where we can actually permanently get rid of it? And enhanced oil recovery is a method where that carbon is ultimately stored underground. It just comes with this baggage of producing new carbon. And so that's an issue.
Thank you, Jennifer. That's very helpful. Any other reactions on the enhanced oil recovery? If not, we have some other questions coming in, so I will move on to that. I think we had an interesting question here about biochar again, but maybe it's to talk more about pathways for CDR and working towards development goals in Africa. So maybe it's starting with Youba, but maybe others have a reaction. So Paul Anderson about biochar being one form of CDR to play that role of moving toward the development goals. Is this really so? And what are some of the additional CDR approaches that can do that? Any reaction?
It can do all the different approaches that has been indicated, and then can play a certain role. Because Biochar also has been advocate, I remember back to maybe 10 years, by the Desertification Convention as one of the techniques of restoring degraded land. Because that was to look at the local problem, local solution, rather than the global. It can work. But everything needs to be contextualized. And then all the different, and restoring degraded land, afforestation, reforestation, all those are not, new phenomena, no new approaches. They are old approaches, but everything is related to how you put in a context, and then how you will feature that in the policies that are the national, from local to the national level.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you. Any other thoughts on that? If not, I'd like to move on. I think there's another question about biochar. So it looks like this is lots of interest on biochar on this session. So this is to Martin and from Rona Larsson, who has already had the earlier question, but he would like to come back to this. And he is saying that really biochar should average, he says, at least 50% more food per hectare. And he says some terra preta soils in the Amazon are today averaging 300% more food after at least 500 years. So he sees biochar as the most competitive CDR approach today, mainly because of the food issue. Martin, any reactions to that? Any thoughts?
Well, obviously there is a fan club of biochar out there. And I can only agree, it is a great technology, and it's of course also not only the improvement of the soil organic carbon, it's also, if you take, for example, agricultural waste, if it's just lying on the side of a field and it's rotting, then of course it is emitting methane. So there is a double benefit here. But I think it also points to a larger issue, which is often not understood, and that is the content of soil organic carbon in soils is maybe the #1 indicator for the fertility of soils. And that is the whole opportunity. While we have too much CO2 up there, we have too little CO2 in our soils. Well, biochar is a great technology to improve the content of soil organic carbon. But there are also other technologies, and holistic grazing, for example, or to put it very simple, animals pooping, right? And trampling it into the soils can also be, if done in a good managed way, a technology where the carbon benefit of the animals improving the soil organic carbon content is actually higher than the methane emissions the animals naturally do have. So if you look at the balance, if you only look at the methanes, the cows are bad news. But if you look at them in a holistically managed piece of land setting, then it is actually a great opportunity not only to be carbon negative, but to improve soils and make them fit again for other agricultural production. But again, the biochar technology is proven, it is simple, it is cheap. There is nothing not to like about biochar.
Can I ask a question maybe? Maybe has an answer. Some of the work that I've looked into with the biochar, the only negative, I guess, is the life cycle of it and understanding the carbon emissions through its production. And so if you start with the biomass waste, one of the things that I said in the introduction is the prioritization of limited resources. To me, biomass waste is a potential limited resource. We actually probably, there's a lot of work doing collecting it all today. Maybe we're missing opportunities. Maybe it's biomass waste is still being burned in some places, right? And or maybe used for animal bedding when it could be used for an energy resource. And so I think it's really important to understand first, like what is the quality of the biomass waste? If it's a woody biomass versus say a nutshell, the carbon density in each of those feedstocks is very, very different. And so if you're going to create biochar, which is exactly what it sounds like, it looks like charcoal. And the key there is that you've locked the carbon in, right? And you don't want it to decompose on a short time period. And so the carbon density is quite high. So if you start with woody biomass where the carbon density is not high, you have to think about what's the energy that goes into the gasification or pyrolysis process to actually get that feedstock for the soils in the end. And I think that understanding what the energy input is, where the energy is coming from, its carbon intensity, is really something that should not be overlooked. And I feel like it's not given quite enough attention in this space today.
Thank you. And I think this really underscores the issue that has come up in a number of times already, that these issues are not just location specific, but very specific in terms of not even just the technique, but what goes in and what comes out. So one cannot talk about is CDR good or is nature-based solution good. One has to talk very specifically about these issues to see exactly how it's going to work. So thank you for that. Jennifer, I'd like to change the subject a little bit, go back a little bit to the more technology-based operations, because that also has an impact on the broader development issues, so whether it's employment or whatever it may be. So just a question to you to start with, but maybe the others have a feedback on that as well, is how do you see the whole politics, the political discussion around discussing sustainable development goals or their equivalents, whatever they may be called, and designing operations for direct air capture? Is it currently part of the policy thinking at all? And particularly for these direct air capture, the really high technology-based approaches, but maybe also for other CDRs.
Yeah, I can speak on that a little bit. I'm really I have a perspective from the US and the policies in the US, and I can speak on that. And so we have two in particular policies in which direct air capture actually does qualify. One is the state of California has a carbon neutrality goal of 2045. And one of the issues is the transportation sector. That's a difficult issue for that state. And so what they have something called a low carbon fuel standard. And the low carbon fuel standard is trading at anywhere between $150 to $200 per ton of CO2. And that could come into the form of biofuels, that could come into a form of even conventional fuels if you have carbon capture at a refinery. But it has to be below a certain point in terms of carbon intensity of the fuel. Now, direct air capture, because it's removal of CO2 from the atmosphere when it's coupled to permanent storage, can offset a transportation sector. And so the state of California is willing to pay for the carbon removed from the atmosphere anywhere. And so provided that it's permanently removed. And so there's a project now that's getting started, for instance, in the Permian Basin. A company called Carbon Engineering is looking at building a direct air capture plant there that removes 1 million tons of CO2 from the atmosphere, and they're planning construction in 2023. And part of financing that is depending on the LCFS of the state of California. Another policy is something called 45Q, and it's a federal tax credit. But the issue today is that although direct air capture is included, it's very difficult to imagine how you can get, how it helps on its own to incentivize doing direct air capture. So my perspective is really 45Q was passed under the Trump administration, and I think it was really designed for coal, and carbon capture from coal, because the qualifying limits are quite high. And so even when you look at, imagine natural gas qualifying, the emissions associated with natural gas per power unit are half that of coal. And so the qualifying limits are quite high for that federal tax credit, and pretty high too for some of these early stage direct air capture. The other piece is economically, it's pretty low. So if you couple to enhanced oil recovery or utilization, it's $35 per ton is the federal tax credit per ton of CO2. If it's to dedicated storage, it's $50 per ton. So it's not a large price point for carbon, but it's a start. And direct air capture does qualify. The other thing I'll point out is that, and we haven't talked about this, but there's a lot of corporates that you've noticed probably have made pledges. In fact, there's hundreds who have made pledges over the last year. Some of the most prominent, are Amazon and Microsoft, and some of these companies, in particular, Microsoft, are making a pledge not just to go to carbon neutral, but to also deal with legacy emissions. And of course, we know that that means carbon removal. And so there are companies today that are looking for projects such that they will be willing to pay for carbon removal credits. And these are companies that are interested in direct air capture coupled to permanent storage, because it's that system, and back to the durability of storage, it seems like something they can bet on. And so I think that it's not just about the corporates leaning in and paying more for today is one thing, but it's not a solution in itself. But it will definitely fund some of these early stage projects. And hopefully policy will catch up ultimately so that we can have a greater impact.
Thank you. That's really interesting, especially the last part that you mentioned about the corporate sector being an interesting driver to sort of clean up what they have emitted in the past and currently, and so that'd be interesting how that evolves. And of course, from our perspective, one of the challenges there is to be sure that we have the appropriate framework in place for measuring, reporting, and then eventually verifying that we know what is being talked about in terms of removals and compensation. So, but it's really interesting. Any other reactions on that from Youba or Martin? If not, then I just wanted to just put this in a. We've been talking a lot about carbon removal and nature-based solutions, technology-based approaches, and so on. Can we say that carbon removal has now become part of the normal climate response conversation? Is it really just part of everything else now? And if not, should it be? And if yes, or if it's not enough, what should be done to really make it happen?
I think yes and no,
Mm-hmm.
because it is not all the per se, the carbon removal per se is part of the global conversation, because it's among some specialists, this one. But if you take it, some other aspects, such as the nature-based solution, everyone actually want to talk about nature-based solution. It's like a completely new discovery. And then for many, and then the technological ones, and then what Jennifer indicated are not part of the conversation. And I think it will be important that we look at how to deal at this period of time to climate issues. Are we ready to tackle it seriously? If yes, we have to get a bit away of the traditional way of looking at it. First, we look at mitigation. Some people do not want at all to talk about adaptation. And then it became a discussion between mitigation and adaptation. Some said that we are only adapting, not having in mind that you cannot adapt if you are not mitigating. And then now actually it's much more broadened, and then to look at, are we ready to solve the climate problem, the climate solution, and then what are the solutions? And then what are the different approaches, including the CDR? In that context, and I think it might be important, and then to look at the institutional aspect, and then to the governance aspect, not only at the global level, but as we indicated also at the national, at the regional level, and then that fuel to have a bottom-up approach rather than a top-down. A top-down can work maybe on the technological solutions, but not on the other nature-based solution that could be a bottom-up by educating, informing, and then training people, and then they have to be part of the solving the problem.
Thank you.
Janos.
Martin?
Well, you were asking what's missing, and obviously the UNFCCC negotiations are still circling around Article 6 and basically the carbon markets. And, I don't need a crystal ball to say that it's really a complicated discussion, but we need somehow maybe a smaller framework in which we can, in my perspective, honor farmers for doing the right thing and getting money to them. And I see many elements for that already existing. One element is that there are large companies, and Jennifer alluded to that, who are actually prepared to take money on the table for their legacy emissions, but also for the delta of emissions they cannot avoid right away while they are working on the technology. And that always needs to be said. It's not a replacement for dramatically driving down the emissions. Another bit is enormous progress in sensor technology, in remote sensing, where slowly you're coming to a point where the content of soil organic carbon can be verified in an affordable way. And it was really expensive to do that some years back. And then not least, there is all the blockchain technology for financial transfers to really bring very small amounts of money to a local farming lady, for example, without risking that it's lost in inefficiency or bureaucracy. And we need to put these different elements together. And maybe there can be a group of countries who are supporting that, teaming up with a group of companies in order to make it happen. Or, and we will see that with the renewed energy in the UNFCCC process that will start of January for obvious reasons, we might see a bit of fresh energy in these conversations. But ultimately, a global price and a global market for carbon, I think, would be good news if we get it right for farmer. And I think we need to overcome this narrative of, offsetting being an evil technology and meaning an exploitation of developing countries. It's a question of how you manage the governance of that, and if done right, and if we start seeing farmers as agents for delivering ecosystem services, I think we would be on a promising way to actually give them a commodity that is globally tradable and creates additional much needed income for people on the ground.
I'd like to just come back on a point, I mean, a couple of points that you've raised, Martin, but also ask this to the other colleagues as well. How should these issues appear in the UNFCCC process, if at all? Now, Martin, you said something about some part of it is happening, some part of it could be somewhere else in something smaller for farmers, if I understood you correctly, not necessarily small agreement, but something not necessarily as part of the big treaty discussions. So any further thoughts on how this might turn up, not necessarily at COP26, but in the UNFCCC process in the future?
Well, if I can come in again, we have a stock of methodologies, over 100, that came out of CDM, of trading under basically the Kyoto regime. Now, this is running out, and we will need methodologies particularly because some of the things that need to happen need to produce money before it produces results. And that means that you need a methodology where in different circumstances, a farmer turning into a specific methodology will be receiving a part of the payments, because we know that applying in this region, this sort of technology typically yields X amount of carbon sequestration. And that is the bit of a chicken and egg situation. You need a bit of upfront investment into the farm in order to turn things around. And so if you're telling people, if you do that right, there will be money for you in 4 or 5 years, that wouldn't work. So we need a system in which there is a bit of upfront financing and an ongoing financial stream to make sure that people stay with this methodology. And that is something, like many other methodologies, were developed for CDM, where I think the UNFCCC process could create a framework for these methodologies. And, ideally, if I'm allowed to think big, really creating this global market where different entities could be coming in and providing their services, maybe in a pooled way, representing 5,000 farms. So it becomes really the scale that we need.
Thank you. And any other thoughts on that? If not, I'd like to ask, we're coming to the end soon, and I'd like to ask one more question, maybe starting with Youba, but perhaps others have thoughts on that as well before wrapping it up. So the question I'd like to ask is, we've talked a lot about the relationship between different carbon removal methods and sustainable development goals. So the question is, how can we encourage and enable, or maybe even require, more transdisciplinary and geographically diverse research on the interconnections between various carbon removal approaches and the delivery of SDGs? Youba, any reaction?
No, I think that this is the good news is that in the African context, the African Academy of Science is now more and more deeply involved and working on climate and sustainable development issues by providing some grants and then to a couple of research institutions. I happen to be part of a network of 5 universities in Africa, and then that are working on a program on energy development, health, climate, and agriculture, and then to more explore in the regional perspective. And I think that if that happens also in other regions, and then that may inform and policies at regional or at national level. The issue is not on the technologies, because the technologies are clear. We have clear understanding. We had a discussion on the biochar, on the other thing. It's really, and then to look at the national regional perspective, and then how it will inform policies at that level. And by mobilizing the research community, and then the universities, and then to much more explore, and then how it can be done also, as Martin indicated, how to get the farmer being part of the overall process.
Thank you. Any other thought on research into this area?
I would
Yeah,
add,
Jennifer? Yeah, please.
so I just want to, I guess, put in a plug. There's 40 of us authors from North America and also Europe, and we have been working for the last couple of years on a new book, which is a primer document on CDR, and we are hoping to launch it online in just a couple of weeks. And so I will share that, but a big part of it is just is really coming up with common framing and terminology associated with the space, just given all of the different backgrounds and expertise and approaches across CDR is so broad. And we specifically have a chapter, for instance, on how to carry out life cycle assessments on diverse systems, so that you can really understand what is the net impact a given set of decisions and choices and boundary conditions will give in terms of CDR. And so excited to share that when it comes out soon.
Thank you. Look forward to that.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you. Then I'd just like to ask all of you to say, just if you have 30 seconds of last thoughts on this topic before we wrap up, before we finish. So in any particular order, who would like to have a first go?
I think this conversation should happen at national and regional level. And then unfortunately, this kind of information and conversation is at global level. The document, the book Jennifer indicated, it will be important and then to have this book translated in other UN languages, so that a wider audience can have an insight of those technologies, what can be expected, what cannot be expected from them.
Thank you. Martin?
Yeah, very briefly, I think we have an army out there of people who are working the land and desperately need help and support. And I think we need to start looking at all the smallholder farmers as agents of change, as people who can do really fantastic work for the climate if we empower them to do so.
Thank you. Jennifer?
I would just emphasize that we need a lot of teaching tools too, and that education is going to be crucial, not just for broader stakeholders, but for the next generation of thinkers in this space, whether they're policymakers, engineers, scientists, biologists. We need really not just the infrastructure, but the human capital to get to gigatons.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to thank you, all three of you, Jennifer, Martin, and Youba, for your contribution. I'd like to thank the participants, those who participated today, who are visible, but also those who are following us on Facebook, and those who will be looking at the recordings afterwards. We hope that this was a small contribution to all the many national and regional discussions that we will have in the future. So thank you very much. And with that, we can finish and close this meeting. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay, thank you. It was a pleasure.
Bye-bye.